We're here to entertain you. We'll sing your songs for good times, the best times. You can't go wrong. We'll two-step, a new step. It won't be long when the Dixielanders are playing. Soon you'll be swaying, so come on, sing along.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Before My Time. I am your host, Kelsey Laurie, and we are going to talk about a guy that not only do I love, not only does Matt love, but we know you love him too. None other than Steve Martin.
Kelsey, one of our absolute favorite TV shows is back.
I'm so excited.
Season 2 is back. I do need to give a shout out. You were one of the people that told me to watch this, but a listener of the show who's also one of my absolute best friends, Lauren, also heavily recommended that I check out this show. And man, I knocked this whole season out in less than 24 hours. And now I'm excited to watch it weekly.
It's a perfect. We, ladies and gentlemen, are talking no other than Only Murders in the Building, starring Steve Martin, Martin Short, and Selena Gomez, who really this show made me fall in love with her. I mean, obviously she's big and stuff, but I was always like, yeah, Selena Gomez. And I was like, oh, she's great. I love her. The dynamic between the three of them, it's the perfect. I mean, obviously Steve Martin and Martin Short have such a great chemistry, friendship, dynamic, all the things. They've done it for years. And bringing in Selena Gomez as this younger, kind of generationally separated trio player, it really made it work, in my opinion. And it's you have the realism, the emotional, they go there and they get your heartstrings, but then there's going to be funny. I mean, you can't have Martin Short not make you laugh. And then you have the murder mystery element. So I can't wait for season 2.
What we decided to do is we're going to just have a little bit of a discussion about Steve Martin. He's someone that both of us have a fandom towards. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there are plenty of Steve Martin movies that are of our time. I believe for Kelsey, we're looking at like LA Story, Father of the Bride, House Sitter era was around when she was on this planet. Based on the Wikipedia, Three Amigos and Little Shop was when I was born, was where he was at. But what I think is worth analyzing is that even starting around the Little Shop time, there's a huge change in what Steve Martin becomes known as an actor a little bit. He really starts diving into more dramatic roles in the mid 80s, doing a lot less like arrow through the head comedy, which was what he was most certainly known for in the 70s. So for the best of our abilities, we're going to try to stay firmly in that like 70s into early 80s.
The early years.
Steve Martin era. Because obviously we could sit here and talk about how much I love Bowfinger and how much we both love,
I mean, there's so much. But my favorite Steve Martin is the earlier films. And that's, even though of my childhood, say the 90s when he was coming out with Father of the Bride, this, that, I didn't know those as well as I did his films in the 70s and early 80s is the Steve Martin I know. And that's just shout out to my parents for showing me the good shit.
It's a bit of a sad story, though, in a weird way. At the same time, if you've read a book that I mentioned last week, Wild and Crazy Guys, but also if you've even read Born Standing Up.
I listened to his book and he read it, Born Standing Up, but this was some years ago, so it's a little fuzzy. But I did listen to it and it was incredible.
He went through this thing where it felt like every time he made a movie after The Jerk, it was such a financial disappointment that like there is this chunk of Steve Martin cinema from 79 to 84 that I think are just comedic masterpieces that he just to this day sees as like, yeah, they were a fine movie, but no one cares. And I think that's his takeaway, which is a real bummer. But I mean, I want to start real quick with what is your first Steve Martin memory?
I don't know, because I did grow up with The Jerk. It can't be one of my favorite movies that I saw ish early is Man with Two Brains. That's kind of like my family's favorite Steve Martin film, but I wouldn't have seen that when I was super young just because it's inappropriate. They would have waited a little bit for that. So I
Yeah.
think The Three Amigos would be my kind of introduction to him. I had Father the Bride. You know, we had the movie in our house, but it wasn't one I put on a lot. And so, yeah. And then SNL. I did watch SNL at a very young age and was exposed to that all the time. And so just kind of seeing those performances. But I think movie-wise would be Three Amigos and then King Tut. My Dr. Demento CD that I've talked about before in other episodes, we had King Tut on there. And so that was also kind of at the same time my introduction to him.
I think for me, it was probably Little Shop of Horrors. We're getting them out of the way early, but I mean, I watched the Muppet movie a lot as a kid, and he has probably my favorite cameo in that movie as the rude waiter.
Oh, waiter?
Yes? May I help you?
The wine, please.
You mad impetuous think it's champagne.
Not exactly. Sparkling Muscatel, one of the finest wines of Idaho.
That's pre The Jerk, even. That is like one of his first filmed appearances, and you're really it's worth analyzing that scene because you really do capture like what Steve Martin's entire 70s persona was in that small little bit, which is like, you know, kind of egotistical, kind of a jerk, like completely lacking self-awareness. Like, I heard a quote from him that I always really liked where he talked about his idea of what's funny is not so much the setup, joke, and punchline, but like the absurd lengths that people will go to make somebody laugh. And he would try to like make that what the comedy was. It wasn't so much writing the best joke, but like being so over the top with the delivery of the joke to make people almost feel sorry for you and laugh. It felt very Andy Kaufman-esque the way he described his vibe.
Yeah, he had a really awesome style of stand-up that was very avant-garde, kind of a lot what we have talked about before, you and I off the air, and I think a little on with the early years of SNL. We were just recently talking about the silly comedy. I forget what the word is.
Oh, it's just abstract. It's
abstract,
like nonsensical.
Yeah, just kind of the bizarre. Yeah, you watch the early years of SNL, and it's like that. It's just these kind of crazy zany, and I think that's why he did so well on SNL and was a host so much, is because that was his style. And it wasn't this, I'm going to say something that's so politically like, oh, we're laughing because it's true, which is very, very popular right now. But it was just that silly, stupid. Mel Brooks does a good job at it a lot, and it's my favorite style of comedy because it's silly, it's funny, and you don't have to get into things, and you don't have to make a point and change someone's opinion. It's just, I'm here to make you laugh. And I like what you said too, that of his quote, that, you know, it's going to the extreme lengths to make someone laugh. And it's great.
And there was in that Wild and Crazy Guys book, there's a point where they're interviewing him, and he says, like, turning on Saturday Night Live that very first night that it aired, his thought was like, oh my God, they did it. They figured out a way to put our comedy on television. Like,
yes,
like he felt really tied to that sense of humor and some like that just, you said, that out there style where it isn't so much topical as it's like kind of shocking, but not like, it's just shocking because it leads you into a sense of comfort and then hits you with the most absurd turn in the corner that it could possibly come up with.
Yeah, and I read actually something in my career that is a quote I heard from his book that really stuck with me, just because I've had such an eclectic career in entertainment and have gone down so many avenues, and sometimes I feel like I've put so much time into learning something and then just kind of, I'm like, well, that was that show. But he said that he's used everything that he has ever learned at some point in his career. And so an example was he used to work at Disneyland. That was his first job. And he worked at the Magic Shop, which Disneyland was my first job. So I'm like, hey, Steve, we're the same. Yeah. And he would go down to the Golden Horseshoe Theater in Disneyland. And the guys there that were doing the Western show would teach him. And he really just had this like passion for on his breaks running down and learning what they had. And so they would teach him all these rope tricks. And so he learned with the lasso, all these rope tips, and he goes off and becomes a comedian. You're thinking, okay, you spent all this time, and he used those rope tricks in Three Amigos. And I can't remember if he said that was advice someone gave him, was saying that you will use everything you've ever learned at some point in your career. And then he goes on to be like, and I did. And it's great. And so the first time I heard him say that, I was like, oh my gosh, it just gave me such comfort in the feeling of all these random skills, some hard, some not, that I've acquired over the years. And some I feel like, God, why did I spend time doing that? That I'm like, it'll come back. And I recently had that experience where I just booked a really small gig this weekend, but it's specifically doing a style of dance that is a very obscure thing that I learned for this one other gig. And I'm like, oh, and I literally today was in the grocery store and I was like, Steve Martin was right. And I love that idea that it's just nothing's to waste and it'll all come back around. So.
Yeah, and I was trying to dig up this one joke. There's a joke that I've heard Steve Martin do on one of his albums, and I think it is the best joke to explain what I mean with what Steve Martin's sense of humor was in how dark and shocking it could get.
And this doesn't happen very often. About 3 weeks ago, I met a girl, and she was real nice, and she invited me to her apartment. So I went over there, and she had the best pussy I have ever...
Oh, now come on! I'm talking about her cat. Now that makes me sick right there. Now, you can't say anything anymore that people don't take it dirty, and I'm sorry, that disgusts me.
That cat was the best fuck I ever had.
It's like...
And that's Steve Martin for you, and that's why...
That is 70s Steve Martin. You mentioned what is also my favorite of his movies, Man with Two Brains. And even just the delivery of the line, like, I can't fuck a gorilla. Like, it's like...
Yeah, it's that, but it's so genuine. I think that's the thing, too. And I said it in our Spaceballs episode that, the best way to do comedy is to play it straight. And Steve Martin is a really, really good example of that, where he's doing the craziest, zaniest thing or saying something crazy, but he has such conviction with his actions and words of doing it. It's, even though he's kind of goofy with it, it's still like, oh, I didn't even get that, or like, oh, yeah. And but he's just so like, but you believe him, and it makes it funnier, which I love. The Man with Two Brains. One of my favorite parts is when he's telling the 3 or 4 year old, the little girl, quick, remember this, call the hospital, tell them it's a brain aneurysm, this, that, and she repeats it all perfectly. And,
little girl?
Yes, sir.
I want you to do something very important, all right?
Okay.
I want you to run home, and I want you to call the ER of North Bank General Hospital, 932-1000. Tell them to set up OR6 immediately and contact anesthesiologist Isadora Turek, 472-2112, beep 12. Have them send an ambulance with a paramedic crew, light IV, D5 and W, KVO. You got it?
ER North Bank General Hospital, 932-1000, set OR6 contact anesthesiologist Isadora Turek, 472-2112, beep 12. Ambulance with paramedics and live D5 and WKVO.
That's good.
Sounds like a subdural hematoma to me.
Oh, it does it? Well, it's not your job to diagnose.
But I thought...
You thought, just go!
It's an unbelievable movie. It's so underrated.
It's so underrated. The Jerk is great. Don't get me wrong. I do love The Jerk, but that gets kind of all the notoriety of Steve Martin's early work, and nobody has seen The Man with Two Brains. And I think it's better, in my opinion. I think it's a better movie. I think it's funnier, and it just does not get the props it deserves.
I think of him having to do the sobriety test so often, where he's like,
no, he has juggles his balls, tap dance, and sing Agalina Magalina. Damn, these sobriety tests are getting hard. Yeah. Agalina Magalina, Hoopashina Wappenbad, just goes for it. He's like, okay.
Even just like the stuff where it's like, Huffafar, it's spelled exactly how it's pronounced, HFUHR.
That's a huge running joke in my family. And Amel Mahay.
It is, but we do have to bring up The Jerk, because that movie, I don't think I realized how massive a success that movie is.
Huge.
$4 million budget brought in $100 million in the box office. Like, that is one of the biggest successes I think I've ever read on a Wikipedia page between budget to box office.
That's pretty, that's a pretty incredible. Yeah, I think it was just kind of, again, one of the first films of its kind where, Steve Martin already kind of has his notoriety and popularity through his stand-up, but to come through and make this film and put his style of humor into an entire movie, it really is. And obviously it's become now, a cult classic, and it really is kind of one of those films of its time because it really encapsulates the time it was filmed. But there's a kind of back to a stand-up quote here from him talking about him thinking about almost the way he started his comedy and how he thought, I'm going to create this thing that's different. And he said, what if there were no punchlines? What if there were no indicators? What if I created tension and never released it? What if I headed for a climax, but all I delivered was an anticlimax? Would the audience what would they do with all that tension? Theoretically, it would have to come out sometime. But if I kept denying them the formality of a punchline, the audience would eventually pick up their own places to laugh, essentially out of desperation. And it's true. And I love going into his mind of like how he came up with his style and being like, what if I tried this? And doing it, and it worked, and it's true, and it almost makes it more funny. It's like those long running gags I think we talked about in the last episode when things just kind of go on and on and on in comedy, like the hot rod fall, when the longer it goes and you're waiting for the big thing to finish for you to laugh, and it does it, and then you just kind of start laughing because you need it to come out, and you're like, I can't not laugh. And it's essentially that same kind of a style in a way, and it's great. I love making audiences uncomfortable, and he does it so well in his comedy.
Oh, hello there. I didn't see you come in. I'm Shane O'Hare of the Geekscape Games Podcast, the #1 video game podcast on the Geekscape.network. Join myself, Derek Krenevelt, and a guest every fortnight as we discuss video game news, video game reviews, and dissections. That's Geekscape Games every 2 weeks on Geekscape.net.
Another thing that you need to give him credit for is of that 70s crew, and I'm including all of the SNL cast at this time, Steve Martin is, without much competition, the best actor to come out of that 70s comedy scene. And what I mean by that is he hits these beautiful comedic beats. He hits these brilliantly dramatic things. He does these almost vaudevillian moments of like pratfalls and tap dance and all that. But even in something like The Jerk, like, I think that the scene where they're singing Tonight You Belong to Me is a genuinely romantic, beautiful scene. And like, he makes that work. He makes that believable. And obviously you've got Bernadette Peters, charming, who's just at her most likable. One of the craziest things that he did is the follow-up film that he did to The Jerk. I've never seen this movie. Have you ever seen Pennies from Heaven?
I was literally, when you said great dramatic film, I was going to ask you, have you seen Pennies from Heaven? Yes, I have. And it is a drama. It is with Bernadette Peters as well. It's Steve Martin, Bernadette Peters, and it's a Great Depression film. And it's really intense and sad. It's a very sad film. Christopher Walken's in it. A young Christopher Walken does this like awesome striptease tap dance on the bar. But they use a real cool, they do lip syncing for most of it. And they use old recordings from the 30s, and it's kind of what I did with my web series, like literally that idea of going out, and it was using these big Hollywood 1930s musical numbers to escape from this terrible, the Great Depression and situation. But they do a really good job giving a great homage to the Hollywood in the 30s, which Steve Martin also has a passion for old Hollywood and these old movies. You can tell, and he also does Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which is that's a kind of film noir homage.
We're going to get there in a second.
Great.
Because
we'll go.
That is something that's worth analyzing.
Pennies from Heaven, I highly recommend. It's not a comedy, so don't get confused with
I want to see it. I wanted to bring it up because in the Wild and Crazy Guys book, they bring this up as like, he talks about how he saw the original BBC miniseries, thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world, heard that they were doing this remake and demanded that he have an opportunity to do the role. And he said his manager said, this isn't the right time. Like, you need to make another Jerk. And he said, like, I don't I didn't
You don't
become
want to be
famous.
typecasted.
Well, he said, I didn't become famous to wait 10 years to do the roles that I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think that says a lot about his headspace, because the truth is that Steve Martin is like this very soft-spoken, very tied to the arts, very like quiet man. And I think by this point, you have to remember that as the jerk is popping off, he's like, what, 10 years into doing the loud, obnoxious shtick. And it's like, all right, you guys took too long to get on my level. I'm done doing this. I want to be more serious. And I think that that's where you lead into something like this. Like you said, Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which is,
I love this movie.
I like this movie. I need to rewatch it again.
It's not hilarious.
No, but it's
not the funniest,
impressive.
It's impressive.
Like,
and I think because I love film noirs so much, I was just like, this is brilliant how he tied in all these clips. And then there are really funny movies, like funny segments of how the bits he does. And it's like, oh, you only created this comedic bit so that you could tie in this scene from this Betty Davis movie or whatever. And it's, like the whole cleaning woman, that like is his trigger. And
Carl Reiner in an interview even said like he was talking about, he's like, look, we took a bunch of random clips from a bunch of movies and assembled it into a plot, and I still think our plot is easier to follow than The Big Sleep, which is like such a...
For those of you who don't know what the Men Don't Wear Plaid, it's a film Steve Martin did, but they literally did that. They took slices of all these different film noir
19 films.
19 film. God, scenes from, all the films from like the 30s, maybe early 40s, black and white. The whole movie's in black and white. And they wrote together a story that they could take a scene from this movie and it would be, say, I don't know, Betty Davis talking, and they would kind of create the set to look like the set she's on and then kind of film it back and forth. So Steve Martin it looks like he's in the scene with them. And so it all kind of connects. It's a really clever idea, and it's really incredible how they did it and tied it together. So I think it's definitely worth a watch, especially if you're a film noir fan.
Yeah, and it's worth also noting that that leading up to the making of the movie, Steve Martin purposely decided to not watch any film noir because he wanted to make sure that he wasn't just going to show up and do like a Humphrey Bogart impression or do any of those. He was like, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't, because it happens to all. I mean, if I listen to
mimicking.
If I listen to a comedian too much, I feel like I start to pick up their like speech patterns for a couple days.
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
and lingo. I've worked with so many people around the world, and I would come home with different lingo from like all my friends I was hanging out that are from the UK, and the slang, and everyone's like, what the hell? And I'm like, sorry, it's natural.
But I mean, we won't go through the full list because, like I said, it's 19 movies. But I mean, it's not like they pulled some obscure deep cuts. Double Indemnity's in there. The Lost Weekend is in there. The Big Sleep, White Heat. Like, these are some heavy hitter, infamous movies. And somehow they got... The other thing that's crazy is that they made a movie using footage. You'd think that they were all from the same studio, but they made a movie using footage from Universal, Warner Brothers, MGM, RKO, Paramount, and Columbia, all blended together. Like, the ability to get that many studios to allow the archival footage to be passed around to a competitor is really unheard of, even in 2022 standards.
Mm-hmm.
So
it really is. Yeah, that's it is. And that just shows you, I mean, the extra love and work that goes into a project like that, where that's gonna be a little more of a fight.
Yeah. And then the next year he follows it up with the movie that we were just raving about, Man with Two Brains. Like, as you said, if you haven't seen this movie,
it literally is my favorite Steve Martin movie. Like, it is just the epitome of his humor, his performance, like all of it.
And there's a great quote. So you briefly talked about this on the Double Indemnity episode, right? But you've got Kathleen Turner, and she is fresh off of Body Heat, the like neo-noir remake of Double Indemnity, and she wants to be in Man with Two Brains. And reportedly, Carl Reiner was a little unsure on if she could do this because she was a very new actor. And he said something along the lines of, I mean, we're gonna really push you. And she goes, you show me where to go and I'll be there. And like she just like she wanted this role. And I think part of it was like doing something like Double Indemnity or doing something like Body Heat that's this like super dark erotic thriller to immediately follow it up with a wacky black comedy parody. Like you're really trying to establish right out the gate, like, yeah, I can be your 80s version of the femme fatale, but I've got other skills too. Like I can show up and I can make people fucking laugh. And she does. She's so
great in it.
horrible in that movie.
She's great. It's you just got to watch it.
And then kind of the last one of that era of him. And I always thought that this was also a Carl Reiner one, but it wasn't, was The Lonely Guy. Have you ever seen The Lonely Guy?
I have seen The Lonely Guy. I actually have a whole like little set of his movies. But I've only seen it once. That was a one time. I need to watch it again, but I do remember liking it. I mean, I like anything Steve Martin does. So
it's another one where I could just describe it as sweet.
Yeah.
It was written, Neil Simon helped write it. Like that's pretty big for a Steve Martin movie. Again, saying like, this is a guy who loves the arts. And then you've got, Neil Simon who wrote like Plaza Suite and like all of these, the Biloxi Blues, like wrote all of these kind of well-established Broadway and theatrical shows. And he's stepping up to write a romantic comedy specifically for Steve Martin. That's pretty fucking cool. And it is, it's a weird, dark movie about a lonely greeting card writer discovers his girlfriend cheating on him and begins his new life as a lonely guy and befriends fellow lonely men. And it's almost like, it's like a romantic comedy version of almost like Fight Club, where it's like this community, this community of lonely guys all trying to find love. Like it's
I need to watch it again.
It's good. There was one of my all-time favorite movies that no one seems to have ever heard of is this film called The Baxter. Have you ever seen The Baxter? Mm-hmm. So it's starring Michael Showalter. He wrote and directed it as well, I believe. But the concept of The Baxter is, the Baxter to him is defined as the guy who gets left at the altar in every romantic comedy. So it's like the dude who's not really a jerk, but like the old love from high school shows up like a couple days before the wedding day. And he plays like a man who's been a Baxter his entire life. And he's about to get married to Elizabeth Banks. And it's like him going out of his way to just make sure that there is no chance that she meets anybody that can stop the wedding from happening. And then of course she bumps into her ex-boyfriend like the day before the wedding, and it's like him going through this full-blown meltdown of like, she's gonna leave, she's definitely gonna have to leave me, like he's here, and thus that's the only way that this is gonna play out, because that's what happens to the character of me in any romantic comedy. It's a very smart, witty film, and it's got a great cast: Michael Showalter, Michelle Williams, Elizabeth Banks, Justin Theroux, Paul Rudd, Ken Marino, and Jack McBrayer are all in it, and then a bunch of other. Peter Dinklage has a small cameo in it. It's a pretty stacked little cast, but it's very much reminds me of The Lonely Guy. I wouldn't be surprised if The Lonely Guy was like the inspiration on The Baxter.
I'll have to watch that, yeah.
But then we get, you pass that threshold, and then that's when you start to fall into stuff like Three Amigos and Little Shop of Horrors, which you start to see him kind of phasing out a little bit of like the over-the-top wacky comedy, especially the next year when he does Roxanne and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And you really start to see him blending more and more drama into his comedies and more and more heart. I openly cry multiple times when I watch Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. As funny as that movie is.
No, yeah, it's funny. As I was kind of going through the list of movies after I'd said what I was first introduced to Steve Martin with, it easily could be Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, because this is we watch it every year for the holidays in my house. They're all kind of, I don't remember not knowing these films, I guess. So
Yeah.
But Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and I think he's so good at it. But it's both him and John Candy and their dynamic that there are some of the funniest scenes in this movie. But it really is. I cry every time I watch it.
Oh my God.
And it's
John
that moment when he
Candy's I
realizes
Like
that
Me.
John. Oh
my God.
yeah, the I Like Me. That's all. Like that scene.
Oh my
Is
God.
just such a heartstrings.
Even
And
just him showing up at the very end on the front step with John Candy, and you're just like, oh, like it. I'm getting joked up talking about.
I know
it is a beautiful. It might be the best John Hughes movie, which I know is hard to like really pin down.
Ooh, I don't know if I could pick my.
But I think that's the one that hits me. I mean, I love Pretty in Pink. I love a lot of it, but man, like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles hits every emotion that it aims to hit.
I love
so
when
perfectly.
he's my favorite. We always, when he goes to get a rental car, and I forget the woman, she's in Ferris Bueller, but she gets off the phone, she's gobble gobble and hangs up. We always do that in my family too. But his rant when he just goes off, I want my fucking car and the fucking keys, and just that little, I wouldn't call it a monologue, but rant is one of my all-time favorites.
How may I help you?
You can start by wiping that fucking dumbass smile off your rosy fucking cheeks.
Then you can give me a fucking automobile, a fucking Datsun, a fucking Toyota, a fucking Mustang, a fucking Buick, 4 fucking wheels and a seat.
I really don't care for the way you're speaking to me.
Yeah, no, that is. I mean, that it literally moved the movie from a PG to an R rating with
Which
one scene. Yeah, I mean, and then continuing down the line, you start to hit my Parenthood, L.A. Story, Father of the Bride, and this really develops the new '90s everyone's favorite dysfunctional dad era of Steve Martin's career.
Which I do want to give I know we're kind of staying away from like the late 80s. Well, I wasn't born yet, but a honorable mention to Dirty Rotten Scoundrels,
which I've realized I've never seen.
It's really good. And then they made it a Broadway show. It was a Broadway musical, which was really good. The music is great, but
I saw the not very good remake of it from a couple years ago with Anne Hathaway and Rebel Wilson called The Hustle.
Oh, yeah. I like Rebel Wilson though, so she's funny to me. But yeah, it was like the female version of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. I didn't know it was Dirty Rotten Scoundrels going in. I just was like, oh, there's like this like con artist one, and it was about a little less than halfway through. I kind of was like, wait a minute. Like, I know this plot. And I was like, oh, I see what they did here. Okay. I lied. I said that was going to be my last, because then we're going to get into the 1990s. So the year before I'm born, I'm allowed to go up to. I love My Blue Heaven with Rick Moranis.
See, that's another one that I haven't seen. I missed.
Oh, it's so great. He plays this like mafia in the witness protections program, and Rick Moranis is the cop that has to kind of watch him and protect him. And he's this real, and he just gives everyone like big tips, and it brings the big mafia energy to the suburbs, and it's hilarious.
Something that I'm realizing as I'm looking at a couple of these box covers, though, there is way more movies where he has his hair dyed not gray than I actually remember. Because it's not gray in Pennies from Heaven. It's dyed black in Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, so it can match up with the back.
When did he go gray though? Because
he went gray. He was gray.
He was
in the 70s.
Early. Yeah. Okay.
Like he had to keep dyeing his hair because his hair is black in My Blue Heaven as well. And like for someone who was known for having very prematurely gray hair, he certainly had to dye it a lot in the 80s for a lot of movie roles.
He did.
Because even his little bit in Little Shop of Horrors, he's got that like greased, like
but
Danny
that's like
Zuko
hair. It has to look like that for that role.
Oh,
so
for sure. If he rolled in with the white hair, it wouldn't have worked. But
no, he needed that black greaser, which he's so good in that too.
Oh, I mean, it's such a small part, but it is such a memorable moment. Like that's what when I saw that movie for the first time as a very little child, my takeaway was Giant Plant and You'll Be a Dentist. Like, I would sing that song constantly. And he's still doing it. I mean, like,
he is.
Even to bring it back to what started this whole thing, like, even when you watch something like Only Murders in the Building, he juggles that comedy with that sincerity so beautifully throughout that entire show.
Yeah, I think he's aged so gracefully in his career with his comedy and his projects, and even, you know, taking the time, and he tours off with his bluegrass band and gotten more involved with like his banjo, and it just, I love where he's gone with his career, and it's not always the easiest to age gracefully in Hollywood as an entertainer, into also just finding some things work better when you're younger, his style, this, that, and he's, even when he started making Father the Bride, that was like such a eloquent transition to those roles of your dad now, and he did it so well.
And he didn't abandon his comedy background either, which I think is, like, I love Bill Murray, but I feel like Bill Murray spent a large chunk of his career trying to run away from comedy.
Matt, it's Murray.
Sorry. I know. Murray. But he spent so much of his career trying to actively run away from comedic roles, where Steve Martin found that healthy balance of like being able to do a dramatic role and still get a little bit of that comedy in there to bring some levity to it. So, you know, we here at Before My Time, we love you, Steve. I'm sure you're listening to this episode.
I hope you're listening, Steve. And look, you started in theme parks. You also performed at Knott's Berry Farm. I'm going to Knott's Berry Farm next week. A lot of my friends do. I love hearing that he started, you know, it's the thing in Southern California us entertainers do. It's the work that's here is theme parks. So that makes me happy that he started there as well. But if you want to come, you know, just say hey to a fellow theme park starter, I would love to have a cup of coffee with you or some bourbon, whatevs. I'd just be happy to be in your presence and honored, Steve.
I know you belong to somebody new, but tonight you belong.
All right, Gelsey, I think we did a very good job of making sure that we showed restraint and focused primarily on the films and TV performances of Before Your and I's Birth with Steve Martin. So for this outro, I say, let's cut loose a little bit. And what is, if you could only pick one or two post your birth movies of Steve Martin's, what would you want to watch?
You threw me with that. I'm not going to lie, because I was ready to tell you my two that I would pick. This is going to be kind of crazy because it's not really a Steve Martin movie, but he's in it, and I love Baby Mama. So that
Baby
easily
Mama's good.
I love Baby Mama so much. So that, but I feel like that's not fair to Steve. Maybe. Wait. Oh, writers. Sorry. Hang on. I gotta get a list of this.
You're like looking at everything. I'm looking at his wiki right now.
Yeah, I was like, this isn't fair. I always forget he was in The Prince of Egypt. I do love that movie. I really liked him in Looney Tunes Back in Action. I thought it was so funny.
I think that is a very underrated movie. I think,
and also it has my husband Brendan Fraser in it, so I 100%. Will pick that one because I just love him. And
see, for me, the answer can only be one film, and it's Bowfinger. I think that Bowfinger is like one of the funniest films of the 90s.
I've never seen it.
You've never seen Gelsey. Robert Downey Jr. is in it. Heather Graham.
Oh, shit.
Yeah, it's got a decent little cast. So highly recommend Bowfinger.
Well,
but yeah, his 90s and 2000s, he wasn't really making movies that I was like in love with at that time. He got really into family stuff, which is fine.
Yeah, I respect that. I do respect that. Adam Sandler did the same thing, and I love those movies. You know, it's not the Happy Gilmore, Billy Madison Adam that we know, but it's again, it's like what I said about him eloquently getting older and aging into his career. I think there's something quite charming when a comedian goes into the family years, and I like that. So, if you guys want to tell us though what your favorite post 9091 film is from Steve Martin and how you feel about his family years, you can do so on Instagram. Find us at beforemytime_podcast, or on Facebook. Just type in Before My Time. Let us know there. And maybe if you feel like gracefully giving us a 5-star review, that'd be so cool. Yeah. I appreciate you guys. And hey, Steve, we're still talking about you. Still want that coffee or bourbon.
Yeah, buddy.
Bye.
You're listening to the Geekscape Network.